All right, so now we are into week 11. So weeks 10 and 11 were sort of unusual in one way or another in terms of the amount of readings. Week 10 had a lot of readings. Week 11 ended up basically having one reading the way the assignments worked out. And that was Julina Oxley's um, rendering of Susan Oken's argument in favor of liberal feminism. So, as we discussed, feminism is not a single monolithic philosophical position or political movement. It is as we say, a broad church under which there are many different doctrines and practices. And so that's why, speaking of liberal feminism in particular, makes sense. It is a specific set of concerns addressed in a specific way, and we talked about that in the presentation itself. Um, so what's the broad picture here? Well, the broad picture, of course, is that feminism is concerned with issues of discrimination, social inequality, injustice, and so forth, which are occasioned by gender and sex differences among people. So we discussed how gender and sex differences might not overlap directly. That is to say, a sexual set of characterizations has to do with biological and functional physiological features of a person, whereas gender categorizations have to do with social and behavioral things. Now, there may be some incidental overlap in these. There may be some causality between certain physiological and certain behavioral traits. There are some varieties of feminism that deny the sort of any type of causation or any significant important causation between biological and sort of the sort of sex and gender features. For the most part, what you get instead is a denial of any normative connection between the two. That is to say, someone having a particular set of biological characteristics does not impose upon them any obligations, nor should we pressure them in any sort of social or legal way to conform to certain behavioral or social categories and stereotypes, right? So at the very least, there is this normative position which says that no one should be pressured, forced by law or by sort of social whatever to conform to certain gender stereotypes. And that is largely what was at issue in the liberal feminism argument, saying that the economic, political, and social equality of women is sort of occasioned by the pressure, both legal and political and social, to be primarily concerned with sort of the unpaid housework of sort of homemaking and of sort of rearing children. The fact that this burden, well, we call it a burden, the fact that this set of tasks, let's be neutral, this set of tasks falls upon them means that they have fewer opportunities because they simply have less time. They have fewer opportunities because expectations on them are different to sort of pursue professional, public, paid sort of work. We don't need to quibble too much about what sort of professional and public mean here versus private and amateur. It's mostly this distinction between paid and unpaid, and to a certain extent between private as in the home and public as in outside the home, right? So the idea in the liberal feminist argument is that these social behavioral patterns, expectations are fostered from the very start of a child's upbringing in their own family unit, their homes, and they're sort of maybe implanted there or reinforced there, and then also implanted or reinforced out in the world, at school, at work, etc., etc. So there is basically nowhere that a person can escape the pressures to conform to these gender stereotypes of behavior and occupation. And so because there's nowhere to escape, this means that this type of oppression, this type of injustice, this type of inequality is ubiquitous, right? And it still exists. So that's one of the primary arguments of the liberal feminist, or that's one of the primary points of the liberal feminist argument that we looked at, is that gender slash sex-based discrimination and injustice occurs still today. It has not been eliminated by the extension of suffrage rights or the sort of slow opening up of the professional world. It still exists because these expectations exist. And because these expectations are fostered and reinforced in the family unit, Oxley and Oken both argue for, in addition to sort of top-down measures, such as laws, also bottom-up measures. They identify that the real change, the real work has to come at the level of the family unit. It is there where things must change. And so this argument sort of stretches across the private and the public, and this is fairly characteristic of many strains of feminist argument. They kind of eliminate the difference between sort of the private and the political, the private and the public, right? So the public is political, the private is alleged often to be non-political, right? But the idea that many feminists have is that the political is everywhere. It's in your personal interactions. So political here means something like the push and pull of social pressure which affects someone's ability to participate in society, basically. So because this pressure exists everywhere, the measures to counteract it, because it is unjust, according to the argument, must occur everywhere. They can't just occur in the courts of law, in the sort of houses of Congress. They have to occur in, the houses of regular people as well. So in addition to that, there was the other reading which was on the list, but which ended up kind of getting pushed by the wayside, the so-called bias paradox. And this wasn't in the same section of the book as the liberal feminism argument, which was in the ethics section. This one was in the epistemology section because it's about, paradox is about, bias, is about sort of what causes and structures beliefs. So we're all generally familiar with what a bias is. A bias, in kind of common speak, is some kind of prejudgment you have that you make either for, positively, or against, negatively, someone or something without sort of seeing the evidence, without experiencing it, right? So if you are biased against a particular group of people, then you will have a negative judgment of anyone from that group before you even meet them, or as soon as you meet them, before you know anything about them. You'll be like, oh, I don't like them because they're part of this group, right? This may not occur at that conscious level. You may not say it to yourself that way, but biases can also be unconscious, or there is some evidence to suggest that biases can be unconscious. These sort of unconscious bias paradigms, implicit bias paradigms, what they're called, are commonly invoked. They are not entirely uncontroversial as to what these sort of tests which allegedly show implicit bias, what they actually show. But it's a big discussion which is important to be had. The bias paradox itself is a problem particularly for feminism and generally for any sort of critical theory which is attempting to overthrow or undermine or sort of just generally question a dominant political philosophical paradigm, here's what the problem is. So, a typical feminist argument against patriarchal um, societal institutions and philosophical institutions is that they have a bias against women in favor of men, or in favor of typically masculine ways of thinking, of categorizing things, and sort of that this bias blinds them to the fact that these are subjective, right? That these choices of categorization, that these choices of investigative methodology, so on and so forth, that they are subjective. That is, they are good because they are judged to be good. Now, the fact that they're subjective and yet treated as objective is sort of what causes a great deal of injustice, right? So if the view that sort of masculine behavior is the more morally worthy behavior, is treated as being objective when it is in fact subjective, then people who do not manifest this masculine behavior will be unfairly, incorrectly judged as morally deficient, right? And that's just one example. So there is a great deal at stake in showing that such systems of evaluation, categorization, and so forth are not in fact objective. The typical way of arguing that such systems of evaluation and categorization are not objective is to say that there is no objective categorization, set of categorizations or evaluations. That all such systems are equally they're equally subjective. None of them has a unique claim to truth. But here comes the paradox. If this is true, then the feminists' own set of critiques constitute nothing more than simply another bias themselves. So it looks like the person trying to be critical of social and intellectual institutions finds themselves in a position of having to undermine themselves in order to undermine the other positions. They have to say, well, my position is just another one like theirs. So this is more of a philosophical and intellectual problem. In terms of being a political problem, if the idea is that all systems of categorization, so on and so forth, are on equal footing, then you just have to sort of work it out in some kind of political democratic compromise. There are some, and we see this increasingly as time goes on, there are some political problems, serious ones, which arise from the idea that there are no systems of categorization which are in any way morally better than others, because then sort of there's a kind of anything goes problem. And that's kind of the problem the bias paradox is pointing out, at least at the intellectual level, is if there's an anything goes, then how can you critique some other system on an intellectual basis, right? So that's very broadly and generally what the bias paradox is about. And I just wanted to have some discussion of that because it got pushed aside in the way that we actually conducted week 11. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more context, helps you to think about these issues, which are, of course, incredibly relevant politically and intellectually, especially in our current political climate. So I do urge you to take some time to think substantially about these. Instead of just reading the news and sort of agreeing with whatever sort of confirms what you kind of already thought, or agreeing with somebody simply because you like them, that's a bad way to form opinions, to make decisions and decide on beliefs. You should do some actual critical evaluation of your own, and hopefully this sort of stuff that we've been talking about gives you the tools to do so.